April 1945. The Reich was collapsing like a building whose foundations had already burned away. Across the gray, rain-soaked plains of northern Germany, roads were choked with retreating soldiers, refugee wagons, and the silent columns of women in Luftwaffe gray, auxiliary defenders of a vanished sky. Their anti-aircraft posts no longer fired. The sound of engines overhead belonged to Allied bombers now, not the Luftwaffe. They marched not in triumph, but in disbelief, carrying range-finding instruments like relics of a faith that had abandoned them. The air smelled of diesel and wet straw, the ruins of cities smoldered on the horizon, and every rumor said the same thing. The Americans treated prisoners kindly, but the Soviets did not. For 5 long years, these women had lived in uniforms that blurred youth into discipline. They had tracked targets on radar screens, loaded ammunition belts, and watched the skies for the black silhouettes of B-17s. They had written in diaries about comrades lost, about frozen nights in bunkers, about rations so thin that bread became more valuable than laughter. But now, as the Allied lines closed in, there was no purpose left, only survival. One of them, barely 21, had once believed the war would make her strong. Instead, she was now one of thousands trudging west, her boots sinking into mud, her insignia cut off to avoid identification. Behind her, a voice murmured a hymn once sung in school, thin and cracked like the country itself. The surrender, when it came, did not feel like rescue. It was silence. Outside a small Rhineland village, a group of exhausted women approached an American checkpoint under white cloths torn from bedsheet. The GIs, mud-splattered, wary, younger than many of the women, lowered their rifles and stared as if they'd seen ghosts. There had been rumors in the U.S. ranks of female soldiers, but few expected to meet them face to face. The translator called out in rough German, "You are prisoners now. You will be treated fairly." And for the first time in years, they believed someone who wore a uniform. In makeshift enclosures along the Rhine, they were catalogued, deloused, and photographed. The paperwork called them non-combatant auxiliaries, yet their hands still shook from the thunder of guns. They were given thin army blankets and soup that smelled of beans and pepper, too rich, almost dizzying after months of turnip broth. That first night, under canvas tents humming with rain, some wept in relief, others out of shame. One woman whispered, "It is over," and another answered, "For them, maybe." They didn't know yet that their journey would cross an ocean. By May, the Allies had seized over 5 million German soldiers. But the women clerks, radio operators, telephone switchboard assistants, were rare exceptions. The Americans didn't quite know what to do with them. There were debates at command posts. Should they be treated as civilians? Should they be sent home? In the end, they were gathered with regular prisoners, awaiting transport to temporary holding sites. The paperwork was slow, the guards uncertain, but discipline softened into routine. Cigarettes were offered through the wire. Some of the women smiled for the first time since 1939. Days turned into weeks. The war in Europe ended officially on May 8, and the world celebrated. In the camps, the news arrived through distant gunfire and the echo of church bells. The women stood in lines, watching the guards cheer. A few asked quietly, "Does this mean we can go home?" The answer was silence. Many of them had no homes left. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, all were rubble. Letters, when they came, bore black borders and half-torn stamps. A few of the women learned that their families had vanished in bombings. Others found that their brothers had died defending a regime they no longer understood. The Americans soon began moving prisoners to larger, better-supplied facilities. For the women, there was confusion mixed with an odd sense of safety. The guards were polite, almost embarrassed. Some played harmonicas at dusk. One private, seeing a young Helferin crying over a burned photograph, quietly handed her a chocolate bar. It melted in her palm before she ate it, sweet and foreign as a dream. Later, she wrote in a confiscated notebook, "They fight differently. Even when the war is done, they still win with kindness." By early summer, Ships were crossing the Atlantic with thousands of German POWs bound for America. Officially, they were to aid the post-war labor shortage, working farms, building roads, cutting timber. For many of the women, the destination was unclear. Some were told they would be processed abroad. Others only realized, standing on docks near Le Havre, that the horizon they faced was not home but exile. The sea smelled of salt and diesel. Gulls circled above like watchful spirits. The guards, mostly Midwestern farm boys, joked about, giving the Fräuleins a look at real food. The women stared at the gray waves and wondered if they'd ever see the Rhine again. The voyage took 2 weeks. Storms rolled across the Atlantic, and the women stayed below deck, shivering in converted troop holds that still smelled of fear and oil. At night they whispered about what awaited them in America: camps, interrogations, maybe even factories. One girl had seen a photograph of New York once, and said she wanted to see the skyline before she died. Another said she didn't care, as long as she could sleep without sirens. They had all been raised to think of America as both enemy and myth, a place of chewing gum, jazz, and impossible machines. The reality would be stranger still. When the ship finally approached New York Harbor, the sun was rising behind low clouds, turning the water the color of tin. The women crowded the rail, their breath misting in the cold air. Then someone pointed, and a murmur rippled through the group, a figure of copper green against the morning fog. The Statue of Liberty. None spoke for a long time. For prisoners, it was an almost indecent sight, a symbol of freedom staring down at those who had lost theirs. They disembarked in silence, boots thudding on wooden piers marked by American flags. Officials moved briskly, stamping forms, directing them toward waiting trucks. Some GIs stared openly, others averted their eyes. The women tried to stand straight, their dignity stitched together by habit. Cameras flashed. One photo from that morning would later appear in Life magazine, captioned simply, "Captured German women arrive in New York." To the American public, it was a curiosity. To the women, it was the end of one world and the bewildering beginning of another. The convoy rolled north through streets lined with billboards and neon signs advertising soap and cigarette. To the prisoners, even the smell of the city, coffee, gasoline, rain, felt unreal. One woman later wrote, "Everything was too big. The cars, the buildings, even the sky." Yet beneath their awe was fear. What awaited them beyond the wire this time? Punishment, or something they could not yet name. As the trucks turned toward a place called Camp Shanks, the rain began again, steady and cold. A guard shouted orders. The women lifted their chins, watching the blur of green hills and telephone poles slip by. Somewhere ahead lay the camp where they would eat, sleep, and think about the war that had made them old before their time. And though none could imagine it then, one morning in that camp, under a mess tent roof, they would meet a symbol of America's power so simple, so absurdly ordinary, that it would leave them speechless, a yellow fruit from a land they'd never seen, larger than anything they had ever known. The trucks reached Camp Shanks just before dusk. A drizzle had turned the roads to liquid glass, and the air carried the tang of sea salt from the Hudson. The women were herded through a double gate under searchlights that hummed like angry insects. Inside stretched a geometry of wooden barracks, water towers, and fences glinting with fresh wire. To the exhausted German auxiliaries, it looked at once like a prison and a small, efficient city. The guards called it the last stop before home. For them, home meant Kansas or Ohio. For the women, it meant a place that no longer existed. They were processed quickly, numbers inked on tags, questions asked in clipped English. Some guards looked curious, others cautious. Few had seen female POWs before. The Americans were polite but firm. A corporal pointed them toward a steaming tent that smelled faintly of soap and boiled meat. Inside, the noise of clattering trays and English chatter rose around them like a storm they couldn't translate. For months they had eaten black bread and watery soup. Now they faced tables loaded with tins of peaches, coffee, white bread soft as clouds, and something yellow piled in crates at the end of the line. One of the women, a 22-year-old former rangefinder operator from Bremen, stopped and stared. She thought at first they were candles, curved and shining. Another whispered, "Bananen?" The word felt foreign, almost mythical. Before the war, a single banana in Germany had been an expensive curiosity from Africa or the Caribbean, rationed and half-green. Most of these women had never tasted one. The sergeant serving them laughed softly. "Go ahead," he said, pushing a fruit onto her tray. "Welcome to America." She held it like porcelain, unsure whether to peel or slice it. When she bit in, the sweetness startled her. Others followed, murmuring in disbelief, soft exclamations in German rising amid the smell of coffee and butter. Later, they would talk about that first meal more than any interrogation or march. The bananas became a symbol of something too large to name: prosperity, normalcy, the impossible luxury of abundance. One woman wrote in her diary that night, "It tasted like sunlight. I realized how small our world had been." The camp itself ran on routine. Every morning at 6, a bugle sounded, and the women lined up for roll call under the eyes of American guards who smoked and shivered in the early mist. They were assigned simple tasks: laundry, kitchen duty, cataloging supplies. For their work they earned a few cents a day, paid in coupons redeemable for toiletries or chocolate bars. The Americans insisted the Geneva Convention required dignity. To the women, it felt like an education in an alien language of fairness. In off hours they heard music drifting from the recreation hall, swing tunes from a radio station called WNEW. The rhythm made them uneasy at first. It belonged to the enemy who had flattened their cities. But gradually the tempo worked into their blood. Some began humming while they swept floors. At night, from across the wire, laughter carried from the American barrack. It sounded young. The guards, too, changed. Curiosity replaced suspicion. One day a lanky private from Minnesota offered a group of women chewing gum. They stared at the soft pink pieces as if they were medical samples. He showed them how to chew and blow bubbles. When one woman accidentally swallowed hers, the others erupted in embarrassed giggles, the first genuine laughter the camp had heard from them. The private grinned. "See? You're practically American now." Letters arrived through the Red Cross, some unopened because there was nowhere to send them back. The women learned fragments of English from food labels: corn, milk, soap. The camp library, donated by a local church, included children's readers, and soon groups of POWs were practicing out loud. "This is a tree. This is a house." The guards watched, half amused, half moved. Yet the strangeness of captivity never faded. Each night, as floodlights flickered over the fences, the women lay awake listening to the creak of the guard towers and the distant rumble of trains heading west. Freedom, they realized, could have a sound, and it was somewhere beyond those tracks. Some prayed. Others dreamed of Germany rebuilt, of families still alive. Rumors spread that they might soon be sent to work on American farms. One sergeant explained that prisoners were helping harvest crops because so many men were still overseas. The idea of touching real soil again made several of them weep. Another rumor claimed they'd be repatriated before Christmas. No one knew which to believe. One evening, after roll call, the kitchen staff discovered that the mess supply had delivered too many crates of fruit. The same yellow fruit. They were told to distribute them to the women before they spoiled. Soon the barracks smelled of ripening bananas, sweet, heavy, unfamiliar. Someone pinned one to the wall with a note: "Evidence of civilization." The Americans laughed when they saw it, but the joke hid something deeper. To these defeated women, even the fruit felt like proof that another kind of world existed, one not built on ration cards and propaganda, but on excess so casual it bordered on mercy. As summer warmed the Hudson Valley, the camp softened. Guards loosened their tone. The prisoners began tending small gardens between barracks, coaxing beans and marigolds from the soil. A Red Cross photographer visited, and asked for a picture of the German girls smiling. They posed awkwardly, holding tools and wearing mismatched khaki uniforms. When the photograph later appeared in a local newspaper, the caption read, "Enemies learn democracy through hard work." None of them knew what democracy truly meant, but they sensed it in the small freedoms creeping into their days: the right to laugh, to taste, to hope without permission. Occasionally, passing soldiers would stop outside the fence to stare. Some whistled, others offered candy. A few women blushed, uncertain whether to feel insulted or seen. The war had stripped them of femininity, and now, under the American sun, they felt human again and guilty for it. Weeks turned into months. The rhythm of the camp became predictable, almost domestic. One foggy morning, as breakfast was served, a supply truck rumbled in bearing a new shipment from the quartermaster's depot. Crates stamped Ecuador, U.S. Army spilled across the mud. The driver cursed the humidity, and a banana fell, splitting open on the ground. The sight stopped a young guard in his tracks. "Crazy, huh?" he said to no one in particular. "We fight a world war, and the enemy's eating better than my folks back home." His voice was joking, but the women who heard it said nothing. They understood too well what hunger meant. That afternoon, a rainstorm swept through, drumming on tin roofs and pooling between barracks. The smell of wet earth mingled with the sweet decay of overripe fruit. From somewhere inside, someone began to sing softly, a lullaby remembered from childhood. Others joined until the camp echoed with fragile harmony. Outside the fence, an American sentry lowered his head, listening. When the rain stopped, a rainbow arched faintly over the camp. The women watched it fade, half believing it was some American trick. None of them noticed the convoy of trucks assembling beyond the gate, engines idling. The next morning, orders would come down: transfer to a new facility farther inland. Another journey, another unknown horizon. For now they sat on their bunks, the air thick with sweetness and uncertainty, wondering if the world beyond the wire could ever taste as strange and as merciful as a single American banana. By late summer of 1945, Camp Shanks had settled into a strange rhythm, a place suspended between punishment and privilege, where the enemy learned how their conquerors lived. Morning mist rose from the Hudson, curling over the fences like cautious ghosts. Inside the compound, the German women swept barrack floors, folded laundry, and cooked under the supervision of American corporals who called them ladies, not prisoners. To the women, that word felt heavier than any chain. They were used to orders barked in German, not kindness spoken in a foreign tongue. Everywhere they looked, abundance mocked memory. Canteens smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Radios hummed with music that felt both innocent and alien, crooners promising love and freedom. The women worked quietly, still haunted by the echo of air raids and the guilt of survival. Yet amid the sameness of days, something unexpected grew, a fragile exchange of humanity through the wire. One guard, a red-haired corporal from Illinois named Mason, began teaching English phrases during lunch breaks. He drew words in the dirt with a stick: apple, sky, freedom. The women repeated them carefully, as if the syllables might crumble in their mouths. He laughed when their accents twisted the vowels. One woman, Anna, the same from Bremen, was bolder than the rest. She pointed toward the guard tower and asked, "This freedom?" Mason smiled faintly. "Not yet." She didn't understand all the words, but she caught the meaning in his eyes. Freedom wasn't just the absence of fences, it was what people did when they no longer needed them. The Red Cross inspectors arrived once a month, their notebooks crisp, their English precise. They checked the kitchens, infirmaries, and sleeping quarters, recording compliance with the Geneva Convention. One of them, a Swiss nurse named Renée, later wrote in her report, "The prisoners appear healthy. Their morale fluctuates between bewilderment and gratitude." That phrase lingered in the women's minds. Gratitude was not something they had expected to feel inside a prison. In truth, the Americans treated them better than many had been treated by their own officers. They were paid 80 cents a day for work. Paper tokens, exchangeable for soap, toothpaste, even small luxuries like postcard. Some began writing to their families in Germany, uncertain if letters would ever reach the ruins. They described the impossible: 3 meals a day, warm showers, guards who said, "Please." They did not mention the ache of displacement, or the guilt that gnawed at them when they thought of the hunger back home. At dusk, the camp often turned into a theater of contradictions. Baseball games unfolded beyond the wire, young Americans swinging bats while the prisoners watched, spellbound by a sport that seemed both childish and profound. Laughter drifted across the field, mingling with the metallic rustle of the fence. The women clapped when someone hit the ball far, even though they didn't know the rules. One of them said quietly, "They fight for fun now." Another replied, "That is why they won." As autumn approached, the women's fear began to soften into curiosity. They asked questions about America, how people lived, what it cost to buy a home, whether everyone truly owned a radio. Mason told them about cornfields that stretched farther than the eye could see, about small towns with Sunday parades and ice cream stands. His words painted pictures brighter than any propaganda poster they'd known. Anna listened the way a starving person watches bread. Sometimes, when no officers were nearby, the guards shared their rations: apples, peanut butter, chocolate. One afternoon, a woman bit into a peanut butter sandwich and froze, eyes wide. "It sticks," she laughed, unable to swallow. The guards roared with laughter. For a moment, the war vanished, replaced by the absurd intimacy of shared amusement. But not everyone in America approved. Local newspapers occasionally published uneasy headlines: "German women kept in comfort," or "Why feed the enemy steak?" Letters from citizens demanded that resources be reserved for our boys. The camp commandant, a pragmatic colonel, insisted that decency was victory's last responsibility. "If we forget mercy," he told his men, "we lose more than we've won." The guards respected him for it. The prisoners never heard his words, but they felt their weight in every fair meal, every kind glance. Despite the calm, nights could be hard. Some women woke screaming from dreams of sirens and collapsing walls. Others lay awake listening to the hum of the generator, counting seconds to distract from homesickness. On one particularly cold night, frost glimmered on the barbed wire like crystal. Anna sat by the window of her barack, tracing the outline of the moon. "It looks the same," she whispered to herself, "even here." In that sameness, she found an uneasy comfort. By November, the first whispers of repatriation spread. Names appeared on lists posted by the gate, though few knew what awaited them on the other side. Would they return to families? To ashes? Some didn't want to leave at all. America had become a paradox, both cage and sanctuary. Mason told Anna that she might soon go home. She looked at him with a sadness that surprised them both. "Home," she said softly, "is maybe gone." He didn't argue. The following week, the camp chaplain held a Thanksgiving service. The prisoners were invited, not to pray for victory but for peace. The women stood awkwardly among soldiers, their breath clouding in the cold. On a long table lay roasted turkey, bread, pumpkin pie, and, at the center, a bowl of bananas. The sight made them laugh. Even here, the symbol returned, bright, absurd, generous. Anna took one and held it up. "For Germany," she joked, and Mason raised his coffee cup. "And for what comes after." Yet beneath the warmth of that day lingered the knowledge that kindness, too, could wound. The generosity of their captors forced the women to question everything they had believed about their enemy, and about themselves. How could the people who destroyed their cities also feed them, teach them, and treat them like human beings? The contradiction cut deep. For some, it became the hardest lesson of all. When winter settled over New York, snow covered the camp like a shroud. The women shoveled paths through drifts that reached their knees, laughing when they slipped. The guards built snowmen and placed helmets on their heads. One morning, a cargo plane roared low overhead, heading east. The women watched it vanish into cloud, and something inside them stirred, a longing not for home, but for meaning. In late December, the commandant gathered them in the yard. "Soon," he announced, "you'll go back to Europe." The words rippled through the crowd like wind through leaves. Some cheered, others cried. Anna stood still, clutching a folded English dictionary Mason had given her. On the first page, he had written a single line: "To remember that language can build bridges, not walls." That night, as lights flickered across the snow, the women packed their few belongings. The barracks smelled of soap and bananas gone soft in their crate. Through the wire, they could see guards smoking, their laughter faint and human in the cold air. One woman whispered, "We came here as prisoners, but we are leaving as witnesses." Another asked, "Witnesses of what?" The answer came softly from Anna's bunk: "Of how mercy can win a war long after the guns are silent." Outside, the wind carried the faint whistle of a departing train. It sounded almost like the sea, the promise of distance, of an ending that wasn't quite an end. And somewhere beyond the river, ships waited under winter fog, ready to take them home to a land that would never taste the same again. Autumn, 1946. The Hudson shimmered gray under the morning fog as the Liberty ship Marine Tiger groaned against its moorings, preparing to sail east. Along the piers stood rows of German POWs, men first, then women, each carrying a duffel stamped U.S. Army property. Their breath mingled in the cold, forming a thin veil of humanity before the steel. Anna stood among them, clutching a single suitcase that held everything she owned: 2 sets of khaki clothes, a bar of soap, and the English dictionary Mason had given her. The pages smelled faintly of peanut butter and seawater. She turned one over and traced his handwriting: "Freedom begins where understanding starts." Then she folded it shut. The horn sounded. The women climbed the gangway, boots clanging against metal, and lined the deck as the ship drifted away from shore. Behind them, the Statue of Liberty rose from the fog, its torch catching the first streak of sunlight. Some saluted it, others turned away. Anna could not. She stared until her eyes blurred, not in defiance but in confusion. That green figure, once the emblem of her enemy, now felt like a witness to everything she had learned about mercy. She whispered to herself, "How strange that freedom waves goodbye." The voyage was long and rough. The Atlantic in October showed no kindness. Waves slammed the hull, sea spray crusted in the women's hair, and the air below deck reeked of diesel, damp wool, and fear. They slept in narrow bunks, sharing whispered stories to chase away the loneliness. One spoke of her fiancé, last seen near Stalingrad, another of a brother rumored dead in Dresden. Anna listened and said little. Each night, when the generator hummed, she imagined the baseball field back in Camp Shanks, the laughter, the music, the smell of fried potatoes. She even missed the guards. The irony stung like salt. 10 days into the voyage, the ship's cook, a black American sergeant from Georgia, took pity on the seasick passengers. He set out bowls of rice pudding and, miraculously, a crate of bananas from the cargo hold. The fruit, bright against the gray sea, drew gasps from the women. Someone joked that even the ocean couldn't escape America's excess. Anna peeled hers slowly, the scent filling her memory with mornings in the mess tent, the laughter, the first moment she realized the war had made her small. She took a bite and smiled weakly. "Twice as big," she murmured. The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "What's that now?" She shook her head. "Just America." When the ship reached Europe, the sky was a pale bruised blue, the kind that seemed to hold its breath before rain. The port of Le Havre lay in ruins, cranes twisted, warehouses hollowed out, the earth itself weary. The women disembarked into a silence so complete it felt sacred. The Americans handed them over to French and British officers, who checked lists and directed them toward trains heading east. The uniforms, the guards, the fences, all began again, though smaller, colder, and less kind. The train clattered across a scarred continent. Through shattered windows, Anna saw villages half buried in rubble, rivers choked with bridges collapsed like broken spines. Children waved from the fields, their faces thin but curious. Each town smelled of soot and boiled turnip. Somewhere near Cologne, the train slowed, and she glimpsed her homeland's bones, blackened spires, streets without names, ghosts moving through the fog of what had been. She pressed her forehead to the glass. "So this is victory," she whispered. At the border station, officials took their names again, stamping documents that looked tired of their own ink. The women were told they were free to go, no welcome, no instructions. Just freedom in the abstract. Some cried, others laughed in disbelief. Anna walked until her boots split at the seams. 4 days she traveled by foot and hitching rides on wagons, guided only by rumors of refugee centers. She found one in a half-collapsed schoolhouse near Bremen. Inside were rows of cots, soup pots steaming faintly, and a nurse handing out ration cards. The walls smelled of mildew and despair. Germany, she learned, was starving. The average ration in her zone was 1,200 calories a day. Bread lines snaked for blocks, and coffee was brewed from roasted acorns. American occupation trucks rumbled through towns, distributing powdered milk and cigarette. The sight of their white stars made people stare with a mix of resentment and longing. The irony was impossible to miss. The nation that had bombed them was now feeding them. Anna ate carefully, her body unsure how to trust plenty again. She volunteered to teach children at the center, using scraps of chalk and fragments of English textbooks left by Allied officers. The children were thin but bright-eyed. One little boy asked if bananas really grew on trees, or if that was just another American fairy tale. She smiled sadly. "They do," she said. "They grow in places where the sun is too generous." The boy laughed. "Then we will never have them." She wanted to tell him that someday they might, that someday Germany would rebuild and its stores would once again smell of fruit and soap and hope, but she couldn't find the courage. At night, the sound of wind through the ruined rafters reminded her of the ocean. She missed the hum of American generators, the rhythm of baseball games, the careless laughter that came from a place untouched by hunger. Once, she dreamed of Mason standing beyond a wire fence, tossing her a banana. When she woke, her hands were empty, but the sweetness lingered, like memory refusing to die. By the spring of 1947, the first ships of the Marshall Plan docked in Bremen. Crates stamped USAID piled up on the docks. Flour, canned meat, medicine, even fruit. The children gathered to watch as American soldiers unloaded the supplies. Among the cargo, she saw it again. A crate marked Ecuador U.S. Army Quartermaster Supply. The label blurred through her tears. She reached out, brushed the wood with her fingertips, and felt the weight of an entire journey collapse into that single moment. The fruit that had once been a symbol of defeat was now a promise of rebirth. The rebuilding began slowly, as all healing does. Markets reopened. Women swept glass from shop floors. Men returned from captivity, gaunt but alive. Anna walked through the streets, now dotted with color again, clotheslines, painted signs, even laughter. Yet she knew something fundamental had shifted inside her. The war had taken her youth, but captivity had given her something rarer: perspective. She understood now that the strength of a nation wasn't in its armies or its slogans, but in how it treated its enemies when the fighting stopped. One afternoon, she peeled another banana, smaller this time, grown in a new Germany rebuilding from ash. Around her, children played in the street, their laughter bright against the clatter of rebuilding. She thought of Mason, of the cook, of the ship, of the kindness that had felt almost unbearable. And she realized that mercy, once tasted, could never be forgotten. The church bells rang somewhere beyond the ruins, echoing over the city. She looked up and whispered, "We learned too late that goodness wins wars more deeply than guns ever could." Her voice caught, and she smiled faintly, as if speaking to someone just beyond hearing. The wind carried the scent of spring, of bread, of distant fruit ships arriving at port. Somewhere across the ocean, America went on with its life, unaware that in a quiet corner of a shattered Europe, a woman was teaching children how to pronounce an English word that once defined her captivity. She wrote it carefully on the blackboard, chalk trembling in her hand. Freedom. Then she drew a small yellow arc beside it and said softly, and this is what it tastes like.